As US Democrats and Republicans each hand US President Joseph Biden and former US President Donald Trump big wins in the Super Tuesday votes, a rematch between the two in November seems very likely. What does that mean for US foreign policy, for geopolitics, and for India? We'll weigh up the differences. Hello and welcome to Worldview at The Hindu with me, Suhasini Haidar. Up ahead, we'll also talk to an expert and former US National Security Council official, Lisa Curtis. But first, the US crossed a major milestone in its election year calendar with Super Tuesday on March the 5th. That's a day that comes exactly 8 months before the presidential election, which is due on November 5th this year. What is Super Tuesday? That's the day about 15 US states, the largest chunk of the US is 50 states, decide on individual party candidates. Who do the delegates want to send for nominations? Trump has trounced his rivals in the Republican Party. Biden is far ahead of any rivals in the Democrat Party. Between the two of them, they're stacked up quite close in national polls at present, with Trump just a bit ahead in the lead. There's a website, in fact, where you can check all the polls. If you like, that link is given on your screen. Now, when those results came out, here's what Trump said, talking about the Super Tuesday result.
Well, thank you very much. They call it Super Tuesday for a reason. This is a big one. And they tell me, the pundits and otherwise, that there's never been one like this. There's never been anything so conclusive. This was an amazing night, an amazing day. It's been an incredible period of time in our country's history. It's been sad in so many ways, but I think it's going to be inspiring because we're going to do something that, frankly, nobody's been able to do for a long time.
He also made a personal attack on Biden, calling him the worst ever US president. President Biden didn't give a speech on Super Tuesday. He said in a statement that results gave Americans a choice between going forwards with him or backwards with Donald Trump. In fact, in his State of the Union speech at the US Congress, he took a further swipe at Trump and his links with Russia. Listen in.
Now my predecessor, a former Republican president, tells Putin, quote, "Do whatever the hell you want." That's a quote. A former president actually said that, bowing down to a Russian leader. I think it's outrageous, it's dangerous, and it's unacceptable.
So clearly, global events and foreign policy will be a key part of this year's US elections. And it is important to keep an eye on how the race goes for that reason. It is very clear also that there's much less buzz about this election, whether it is internationally or even domestically. And that's for a number of reasons. One, both contenders have been president before. There are no real surprises. Each have had a term. Trump from 2016 to 2020, Biden from 2020 to 2024. Biden is, in fact, the oldest candidate. And this is another reason. He's the oldest president at 81, Trump at 77, a close second to him. And the concerns about their mental and physical health really overshadow other concerns. It is also true that each of them has already completed one term, so there's just one term ahead of them. So maybe not so many changes coming up as a result of the elections. Also, neither candidate has many challengers. Any challenger should have appeared by this point in the race. Trump's last rival, Nikki Haley, bowed out of the race this week, winning just one state in the Super Tuesday, which was Vermont, and already she had another state, DC. Even so, even despite all of this lack of interest, if you like, a lot does hinge for the world on what the result will be. So let's just take a look at the differences between them on 5 key global issues. If you look first at China and the Indo-Pacific, Biden is likely to continue with his Indo-Pacific policy, his support of the Quad, other partners and allies, to challenge China. Trump, more likely to fight China with trade measures, tariffs and sanctions, not as much security-driven, but perhaps would continue the Indo-Pacific policy. On Russia, Biden says he's committed to helping Ukraine fight Russia, more military supplies, target Putin, whereas Trump really is silent, if you remember, saying not much on Russian President Putin himself. He's also said he's likely to pull funding for Ukraine, making European allies pay much more for that. Look at the Middle East conflict then, particularly the Israel bombardment of Gaza, but also ties in the Middle East. Biden is likely to continue the support for Israel, but then push for having less Palestinian civilian casualties. The US is also against any occupation of Gaza by Israel. Trump, on the other hand, will support Israel even more. He's unlikely to factor in civilian casualties or what happens to Gaza, but he will be keen to broker peace deals, another deal like the Abraham Accords between Israel and countries in the Middle East, this time perhaps with Saudi Arabia. If you look at NATO and US involvement abroad, Biden will push for strengthening NATO, already adding more members like Sweden and Finland. US engagement on all geopolitical conflicts is something he will look for. Trump, on the other hand, will be more hands-off on conflict. He won't want US boots on the ground abroad. He's already demanded that NATO pays its share and at once even threatened to pull out. The fifth key issue is on globalism and multilateralism, the United Nations and such. Biden will continue a strong engagement with the UN and other multilateral organizations, particularly when it comes to future challenges like climate change, AI and cyber warfare, nuclear, and others. Whereas Trump has had a campaign slogan where he said he would reject globalism very clearly. He's also likely to make fighting radical Islamic terror, Iran, talking about restoring American leadership in the world. He's likely to defund or withdraw from UN organizations and agreements, remember, as he did in the previous term, where he walked out of UNESCO, he walked out of the Human Rights Council, walked out of deals like the JCPOA with Iran, as well as the climate change, the UN Climate Protocol. So that is as far as the global issues are concerned. What are the key issues for India when it comes to a Biden versus Trump contest? Now, both sides have prominent candidates who happen to be Indian Americans. So there's this particular interest there, or should be a certain amount of interest in the race. Remember, US Vice President Kamala Harris is on the ticket with Biden. And while former governor and former US ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, has now bowed out, Trump has kept Vivek Ramaswamy, who dropped out earlier, and even Tulsi Gabbard. She's not of Indian origin, but identifies as a Hindu American, very close to many in the Indian government. And both have been identified as possible running mates for Trump. So what are the key issues if it comes to India? They will be looking, of course, at this Indian flavor, but the more important ones will be, one, trade and investment. How will Biden do versus another term of Trump? Remember, Trump had withdrawn India's GSP status, slapped a lot of tariffs, so that will be one concern. Then it comes to defense ties. That will be another key engagement area. And of course, the hope that there'll be continuity from Prime Minister Modi's visit to Washington last year. On Pakistan and China, India will be keen to see whether Biden continues a fairly neutral position or a position close to the Pakistani government, closer than to the previous government. Trump, of course, had been very tough when it came to Pakistan and China, India's two big rivals continentally, and that will be worth watching. The fourth issue will be human rights issues, and certainly President Trump has shown in his previous tenure as well that human rights issues don't figure that much on his agenda. But for the Biden administration, human rights, press freedom, minority rights, NGOs, these are all areas where the Biden administration has often spoken up and, of course, received a rebuke from New Delhi. And finally, the question of immigration and the Indian diaspora, both the question of visas for Indians, making it easier for Indians there, but also the question over India's relationship with the diaspora, that it considers anti-government or separatist. And of course, the Panun case comes into focus, where they have possibly going to have different reactions. Earlier, I spoke to Lisa Curtis, who was the Deputy Assistant President to then President Trump at the US National Security Council. She's now the Director for Indo-Pacific Security Programming at the Center for New American Security. And I began by asking her just how much would hinge on the outcome.
Well, I think it depends on what region you're talking about. So if you're talking about a country like India, for example, I think that we would not see major changes, There's been bipartisan support over the last 20 years, whether it's Republican or Democrat, favoring building up the relationship with India, building up India's capabilities so that it can play a stronger role in the Indo-Pacific and help with that bouncing of China.
That when in 2018 the Trump administration really took on Iran and demanded that India reduce its oil, in fact completely cancel out its oil supplies from Iran, then the Trump administration went ahead until India did actually completely zero out its oil imports from Iran. So do you expect that a Trump administration would have the understanding the Biden administration does? And it would be particularly interesting to know what the expectation from India when it comes to the scenario of China and Taiwan that you described.
The Biden administration has been incredibly patient with India on the issue of India's support to Russia, importing energy, increasing its energy imports from Russia, taking a neutral stance at the UN and such. And you also have the issue of the plot to assassinate the Sikh activists in the United States. The fact that these two issues, Russia and the assassination plot,
alleged assassination
alleged assassination plot, have not really disrupted the U.S.-India relationship, says something about the foundation of that relationship and how much has been invested in it over the last several years. But when it comes to the Trump administration, I think it really depends on the issue. Iran, yes, that will be an issue that President Trump is very tough on. For example, there is not the expectation that India would send warships or get involved militarily. So, I think there's an understanding that while India, would provide diplomatic support to Taiwan, humanitarian support, may even allow the U.S. some kind of basing or logistics support. In the Trump administration, I think it's difficult to say. I think that, we did see, for instance, on the case of Afghanistan, that President Trump had very high expectations, wanted India to be more involved in supporting Afghanistan.
Lisa Curtis there on Biden versus Trump for India. So what's Worldview's take? The election of the US president this year doesn't ignite as much interest for a number of reasons, and especially the fact that the candidates have already been in this position before, and whoever wins will only get one term, 4 years in office, and so has a limited ability to take forward their policies this point on. While India has a good record of dealing with both, there's no doubt that there is more predictability with President Biden as opposed to the social media surprises that President Trump had dealt out in his term. A Trump administration, however, will take a less of an interest in concerns about India's democracy, human rights, and press freedoms. The most significant part of their policies for India will no doubt be how US ties with China fare, as that will decide many developments in India's own region. So it's time for some reading recommendations. We do have a few new books, in fact, this time. One is called, and this is really a fun read, it's called The Internationalist, The Fight to Restore American Foreign Policy After Trump. This is by Alexander Ward. It's a recent book. Another one called America in Retreat, Foreign Policy Under Donald Trump by Mel Gurta. That's got some good reviews. I haven't been able to read it yet. Another book is called Confidence Man, The Making of Donald Trump and the Breaking of America by Maggie Haberman from the New York Times. Remember, these are all, many of them former journalists who are pretty critical of President Trump. This is a book for those of you who want to understand how Trump won the first time and possibly could the next. And that's called Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance. He then went on to run for office as well for the Republicans. This is an interesting book. It's called A Lot of People Are Saying, The New Conspiracism and the Assault on Democracy. This is a very academic book, but interesting, by Nancy Rosenblum and Russell Muirhead. Then there's The Persuaders at the Front Lines of the Fight for Hearts, Minds and Democracy by Anand Giridhar Das. So we're looking really theoretically right now at the US elections and what those issues will mean for them. Closer to the elections, we'll get you other books. And finally, there's a book I've spoken about before, Open Embrace, India-US Ties in a Divided World by my colleague at The Hindu, Verghese George. We hope you enjoy reading those and do join us again here on Worldview from the team. Thanks for watching.